My wife arrived with her new young boyfriend and a 4-year-old child. Wife, sign these divorce papers and leave now. My daughter, what? You really don't know. She showed my wife a letter, and my wife and her new boyfriend suddenly went pale. The interstate stretched out like a ribbon of broken promises as I drove home that Thursday afternoon, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. 3 weeks on the road, dealing with supply chain nightmares in Cleveland, and all I wanted was to collapse into my favorite recliner with a cold beer and maybe catch the tail end of whatever game was on. Hell, I would have settled for one of those cheesy cooking shows Naomi always had running in the background. At 46, I'd learned to appreciate the simple things, the predictable rhythm of suburban life, the sound of Ava's music drifting down from upstairs, even Naomi's occasional complaints about the neighbor's dog. My name is Marcus Fielding, and if you'd asked me that morning what my biggest problem was, I probably would have said something about the rising cost of diesel fuel or how my lower back was acting up again. I thought I had it all figured out, you know? Not rich, not poor, just comfortably average. A decent house in a decent neighborhood where people still waved when they passed each other on their morning jogs. Naomi and I had been married for 18 years. Sure, we'd hit some rough patches like any couple, but we always worked through it. At least, that's what I told myself during those long drives between cities. The logistics business had been good to me. Nothing glamorous, just moving stuff from point A to point B, making sure the right products ended up in the right warehouses at the right time. It meant a lot of travel, a lot of nights in generic hotel rooms with paper-thin walls and continental breakfasts that all tasted the same. But it paid the bills, put Ava through her private school, and kept us comfortable. Naomi used to joke that I was like a traveling salesman from the old days, except instead of selling vacuum cleaners, I was selling efficiency. She used to joke about a lot of things. Pulling into our driveway, I noticed a beat-up Honda Civic parked where I usually left my truck. Probably one of Ava's friends, 17-year-olds, and their hand-me-down cars, right? I grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat and trudged up the front steps, already rehearsing my dad jokes about whatever boy was brave enough to visit while I was away. The porch light was on even though it was barely past 3 in the afternoon, which struck me as odd, but Naomi had always been particular about keeping the house well lit. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual, but something felt different the moment I stepped inside. The air was thick with tension, like the few seconds before a thunderstorm hits. I could hear voices coming from the living room. Naomi's voice, sharp and deliberate, and a deeper voice I didn't recognize. Male. Young. Naomi. I called out, dropping my bag by the coat closet. I'm home. The voices stopped abruptly, followed by the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I rounded the corner into the living room and froze like I'd walked into a movie scene that didn't make sense. There was my wife of 18 years, standing by the fireplace mantel where our wedding photos used to be, looking like she'd been caught red-handed. Next to her stood some kid who couldn't have been older than 25, all lean muscle and cocky attitude, wearing one of those trendy flannel shirts that cost more than my work boots. But it was the child that really threw me for a loop. A boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, clinging to the young man's leg like he belonged there. The kid had Naomi's dark hair and was staring at me with the kind of curious intensity that children have when they're trying to figure out if you're friend or foe. Marcus, Naomi said, and her voice had this cold, practiced quality that I'd never heard before. It was like listening to a stranger wearing my wife's face. We need to talk. I looked around the room, taking inventory of what was different. The family photos were gone. Naomi's books had been cleared from the shelves. Even her favorite throw pillows were missing from the couch. It was like someone had systematically erased her presence from the space, or maybe prepared to erase mine. What's going on here? I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. The young man shifted uncomfortably, his arm tightening around the boy's shoulders in a gesture that was unmistakably protective. Possessive. Naomi reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with legal documents. She held it out to me like she was handing me a takeout menu. These are divorce papers, she said, matter of fact as discussing the weather. I need you to sign them. The words hit me like a sucker punch to the gut. 18 years of marriage, reduced to a stack of papers and delivered like a business transaction. I stared at the envelope, not taking it, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go, was it? Weren't there supposed to be fights first? Counseling? Some kind of warning that your entire life was about to implode? Sign these and leave now, she continued, and there was something almost gleeful in her tone. Like she'd been planning this moment, rehearsing it, savoring it. The young man cleared his throat. Maybe I should take Tyler outside, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Tyler. So the kid had a name. No, Naomi said firmly. He should see this. This is the beginning of our new life together. Our new life. The words echoed in my head as I finally understood what I was looking at. This wasn't just a divorce. This was a complete replacement. The young man, the child, even the way they were arranged in my living room like they were posing for a family portrait. It was all carefully orchestrated. I felt something inside me shift, like a gear clicking into place. The shock was wearing off, replaced by something colder and more calculating. 23 years in logistics had taught me to think systematically, to see the bigger picture, to plan for contingencies. And as I stood there holding those divorce papers, looking at my wife's smug expression and her boy toy's nervous fidgeting, I realized something important. Naomi had no idea what she just walked into, but she was about to find out. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have in my hands, like it was loaded with more than just legal documents. I could feel the weight of 18 years pressing down on my shoulders as I stared at Naomi, trying to reconcile this cold stranger with the woman who used to steal my hoodies and leave little notes in my lunch bag. The woman who cried during those sappy romantic comedies we'd watch on Sunday afternoons, curled up together on this very couch that now felt like foreign territory. Just like that, I heard myself say, my voice sounding hollow and distant. 18 years, and you want me to sign papers and walk away like none of it mattered? Naomi's expression didn't soften even a fraction. If anything, she looked annoyed, like I was being deliberately dense about something obvious. Marcus, don't be dramatic. People grow apart. It happens. I've moved on, and you need to do the same. Moved on. Like our marriage was some phase she'd outgrown, like switching from drinking beer to wine or deciding she was too old for pop music. The casual cruelty of it was almost impressive in its completeness. I glanced at the young man, Lewis. I'd heard her call him earlier, and caught him studying me with the kind of calculating look guys get when they're sizing up potential competition. Except there was no competition here, was there? This had already been decided without me. Lewis was everything I wasn't at his age, lean where I was starting to show my middle age spread, confident in that reckless way that only comes from never having real responsibility. His jeans probably cost more than what I spent on groceries in a month, and his hair had that deliberately messy style that takes an hour to achieve but looks effortless. He kept one protective arm around little Tyler, who was peeking out from behind Lewis's leg like he was watching a movie he wasn't sure he was allowed to see. So this is him, I said, nodding toward Lewis. Your upgrade. Don't be petty, Naomi snapped, but I caught the slight flush that crept up her neck. Lewis is a good man. He cares about Tyler, and he cares about me. He's going to be a real father to that boy, not someone who's always on the road chasing the next contract. There it was, the knife twist I'd been expecting. All those years of working my ass off to provide for this family. All those nights in crappy hotels so I could keep the checks coming, and it got reduced to chasing contracts, like I was some deadbeat who couldn't hold down a real job. The unfairness of it burned in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. 23 years in business had taught me never to let the other side see you sweat. Tyler stepped out from behind Lewis and started wandering around the living room, his small hands trailing along the furniture like he was already claiming it. He picked up one of my baseball trophies from high school. A stupid little plastic thing I'd kept on the bookshelf for sentimental reasons, and turned it over in his hands with the focused curiosity that kids have for anything shiny. Careful with that, buddy, Lewis said gently, and I had to admit the kid seemed comfortable with him. Natural, even. It made me wonder how long this had been going on, how many cozy little family scenes had played out in my house, while I was busy making sure we could afford to keep it. When did you bring him here? I asked, watching Tyler explore what used to be my space. How many times has he been in my house? Our house, Naomi corrected, but there was something defensive in her tone. And it doesn't matter. What matters is that we're making this transition as smooth as possible for everyone involved. Transition. Like this was some corporate restructuring instead of the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my life. I looked around the room again, noticing more details now that the initial shock was wearing off. The missing photos weren't random. They were specifically the ones with me in them. The family vacation shots, the anniversary dinners, even the casual snapshots from backyard barbecues. It was like someone had gone through and systematically erased my presence from the visual history of this house. But they'd left the furniture, I noticed. The expensive stuff. The 60-inch TV I'd saved for months to buy. The leather recliner that had taken me 3 years to break in properly. Even the kitchen appliances were still there. I could see the fancy espresso machine through the doorway, the one Naomi had insisted we needed for entertaining. Funny how the things with actual value didn't need to be erased along with my memory. "You've got this all figured out, don't you?" I said, settling into my recliner without being invited to sit in my own living room. The familiar comfort of worn leather against my back was reassuring, a small anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted sideways. New family, same house, same lifestyle. Just swap out the husband for a newer model. Louis shifted uncomfortably, and I caught him glancing toward the door like he was reconsidering his life choices. Good. This couldn't be what he'd signed up for when he'd started fooling around with a married woman. Playing house was probably a lot more fun when it was just fantasy and stolen moments, not legal documents and custody arrangements and 46-year-old husbands who weren't cooperating with the script. "Louis understands what it means to be present," Naomi said, her voice getting that sharp edge it always got when she felt cornered. "He's not constantly traveling, constantly putting work before family. Tyler needs stability, needs someone who's actually here." I almost laughed at the irony. She was lecturing me about stability while she'd just blown up our daughter's home life and tried to install a replacement family like we were swapping out kitchen appliances. But Tyler seemed oblivious to the adult drama swirling around him. He'd moved on from my trophy to the remote control, pressing buttons and watching the TV channels flip by with the delighted fascination of a kid who'd discovered a new toy. "Where's Ava?" I asked suddenly, realizing our daughter should have been home from school by now. "Does she know about this little family meeting?" Something flickered across Naomi's face. Uncertainty, maybe even a flash of guilt. "She's upstairs. This doesn't concern her right now." "The hell it doesn't," I said, standing up from my chair. "You're trying to divorce her father and move strangers into her house. I'd say it concerns her plenty." That's when I heard the footsteps on the stairs, deliberate and measured. Ava had been listening, of course. Smart kid. She'd probably heard my truck in the driveway and figured out something was wrong when the house got quiet. As her footsteps got closer, I saw Naomi's confident mask slip just slightly, revealing something that looked almost like fear. But she had no idea what was coming. The sound of Ava's footsteps coming down the stairs was like a countdown timer in my head. Each step brought her closer to this nightmare scenario her mother had orchestrated, and I felt a protective rage building in my chest that had nothing to do with my own hurt feelings. Whatever beef Naomi had with me, whatever twisted logic had led her to this moment, Ava didn't deserve to get caught in the crossfire. She was 17, for Christ's sake, supposed to be worried about prom dresses and college applications, not watching her family implode in real time. When she finally appeared at the bottom of the staircase, I could see she'd been crying. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, and she had that hollow look kids get when they've heard something they can't unhear. She was wearing her Valley High sweatshirt and those ratty jeans with the holes in the knees that I was always threatening to throw away, looking so young and vulnerable that it took everything I had not to march over and wrap her in a bear hug. "What is going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air like smoke, and I watched Naomi's face transform back into that cold, business-like expression she'd been wearing when I walked in. It was like watching someone flip a switch, warm, nurturing mother one second, ruthless strategist the next. Tyler stopped playing with the remote control and looked up at Ava with curious interest. To him, this was probably just another adventure, another new person to meet in what had clearly become a very eventful day. Kids that age don't understand the weight of adult decisions, the way lives can get shattered and rebuilt in the space of an afternoon conversation. "Ava, honey," Naomi said, her tone carefully modulated like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed. "I was going to talk to you about this separately, but since you're here now, we might as well get everything out in the open." Louis looked like he wanted to disappear into the furniture. The kid had probably thought he was getting involved with some unhappy housewife looking for excitement, not signing up for a full-scale family drama with teenagers and custody battles. He kept glancing between Ava and the front door like he was calculating escape routes. "This is Louis," Naomi continued, gesturing toward her boy toy like she was introducing him at a dinner party. "And this is Tyler. They're going to be part of our family now." The casual way she said it, like she was announcing we'd gotten a new pet, made my blood pressure spike. Our family. Like she had any right to redefine what that meant without consulting the other people who actually lived here. Ava stared at Louis and Tyler with the kind of stunned disbelief I'd probably been wearing a few minutes earlier. "Part of our family," Ava repeated slowly, like she was testing how the words tasted. "What about Dad?" "Your father and I are getting divorced," Naomi said matter-of-factly. "It's time he left, so we can all move forward with our lives." That's when I saw something shift in Ava's expression. The shocked, hurt little girl disappeared, replaced by someone I barely recognized, someone with steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. She looked exactly like her mother used to look when she was gearing up for a fight, back when Naomi still had fight left in her. "Move forward," Ava said, her voice getting stronger. "Mom, do you have any idea what you're doing?" "I'm doing what's best for all of us," Naomi replied, but there was a defensive edge creeping into her tone. "You'll understand when you're older. Sometimes marriages just run their course." Louis shifted uncomfortably, still holding Tyler's hand, but looking like he was reconsidering every life choice that had led him to this moment. The kid was smart enough to sense the tension even if he didn't understand the details. His cocky confidence from earlier was evaporating fast, replaced by the dawning realization that he'd stepped into something way more complicated than he'd bargained for. "When I'm older," Ava repeated, and there was something almost dangerous in her laugh. "Mom, I'm 17, not 7. I know exactly what's going on here." She took a step closer to Naomi, and I could see her hands trembling, not with fear, but with barely controlled anger. My daughter had always been sharp, always been able to see through bullshit with the kind of clarity that adults spend years trying to recover. But this was different. This was personal. "You think you can just replace Dad with some random guy and his kid, and we'll all play happy family?" Ava's voice was rising now, all pretense of calm evaporating. "You think you can rewrite our entire lives because you decided you wanted something different?" "Ava, you need to calm down," Naomi said, but her authoritative tone wasn't working anymore. The power dynamic in the room was shifting, and everyone could feel it. "No, Mom, you really don't know, do you?" Ava said, and there was something almost pitying in her voice now. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, official-looking, with that cream-colored stationery that expensive lawyers use. The moment Naomi saw that letter, the color drained from her face so fast I thought she might pass out. Her confident mask cracked completely, revealing something raw and panicked underneath. Louis looked between them with growing alarm, clearly realizing that whatever was in that letter, it wasn't part of the plan. "Ava," Naomi whispered, her voice barely audible. "Where did you get that?" My daughter held up the letter like it was a winning lottery ticket, and for the first time since I'd walked into this nightmare, I felt a spark of hope. Whatever Ava had in her hands, it was about to change everything. "Aunt Eloise sent it to me last month," Ava said, her voice steady as a rock. "Right before she died. She wanted to make sure I knew what was in her will." And just like that, the entire game changed. The silence that followed Ava's words was deafening. I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the one Naomi had inherited from her Aunt Eloise 3 years ago, counting out the seconds like a metronome. Naomi stood frozen by the fireplace, staring at that cream-colored letter in our daughter's hands like it was a loaded gun pointed at her chest. And maybe, in a way, it was. Aunt Eloise. Even hearing her name brought back a flood of memories. Eleanor Catherine Morrison, everyone called her Eloise, had been Naomi's saving grace after her parents died in that car accident when she was 12. Eloise had swooped in like some kind of fairy godmother, taking Naomi from foster care hell and giving her a real home, a real chance at life. She was the woman who taught Naomi how to balance a checkbook, how to drive stick shift, how to stand up for herself in a world that didn't always give a damn about orphaned kids. For years, Eloise had been like a second mother to both of us. She was the one who helped us with the down payment on this house, who babysat Ava when she was little, who showed up with casseroles whenever life got tough. She was family in the truest sense of the word, not because she had to be, but because she chose to be. And when she got sick with cancer 2 years ago, Naomi had been devastated. But something had changed between them in those final months. Naomi had started visiting less, making excuses about work and commitments. She'd gotten snippy whenever I brought up Eloise's condition, brushing off my suggestions that we should spend more time with her while we still could. I'd chalked it up to grief. Some people handle impending loss by pulling away, protecting themselves from the inevitable pain. Now, looking at Naomi's pale face and shaking hands, I was starting to wonder if there had been more to it than that. "Let me see that," Naomi said, reaching for the letter with trembling fingers. But Ava stepped back, holding the document protectively against her chest. "I don't think so, Mom," Ava said, her voice steady but cold. "I think everyone should hear this at the same time." Louis had gone completely silent, his arms still around Tyler, but his attention laser-focused on the unfolding drama. The poor bastard was probably starting to realize that whatever he'd gotten himself into was way more complicated than a simple affair with a lonely housewife. Tyler, oblivious to the adult tension, had wandered over to the bookshelf and was now pulling down random volumes, creating a small pile on the carpet. "Ava, please," Naomi whispered, and for the first time since I'd walked into this nightmare, she sounded genuinely afraid. "There are things you don't understand." "Oh, I understand plenty," Ava cut her off. "I understand that Aunt Eloise always worried you were too selfish to be trusted with real responsibility. I understand that she spent the last 2 years watching you pull away from everyone who loved you. And I understand that she was smart enough to do something about it." She unfolded the letter with deliberate care, smoothing out the creases like she was handling a priceless artifact. The paper rustled in the sudden quiet, and I found myself holding my breath without realizing it. Whatever was in that letter, it was about to change everything. I could feel it in my bones. "This is from Morrison, Peterson and Associates," Ava began, her voice taking on the formal cadence of someone reading legal documents. "Aunt Eloise's law firm. It's dated 6 weeks before she died." Naomi made a small, strangled sound, but Ava kept reading. "Dear Ava," she continued, "your Aunt Eloise asked us to send you a copy of her final will and testament, along with this explanatory letter. She wanted to ensure that you understood her intentions and the reasoning behind her decisions." Louis shifted nervously, and I caught him glancing toward the front door again. Smart kid, he was starting to smell trouble. Tyler, meanwhile, had discovered my collection of old National Geographic magazines and was flipping through one with the focused intensity that only children can muster. "The house at 1247 Maple Street," Ava read, her voice getting stronger. "Along with all furnishings, the investment portfolio valued at approximately $400,000, and the remainder of my estate, I leave jointly to my beloved great-niece Ava Fielding and her father, Marcus Fielding." The words hit me like a physical blow. $400,000. I'd known Eloise was comfortable. She'd owned her own home, lived modestly but well, but I'd had no idea she'd accumulated that kind of wealth. More importantly, she'd left it to Ava and me, not Naomi. The woman who'd raised her, who'd been like a daughter to her for over 30 years, had been deliberately excluded from her inheritance. "There's more," Ava said, and her eyes found mine across the room. There was something like grim satisfaction in her expression, tempered by what looked like genuine sadness. "It gets really interesting." Naomi had sunk into the chair by the window, her face buried in her hands. She looked like she was trying to disappear, to somehow will herself out of existence rather than face whatever came next. Louis stood behind her uncertainly, clearly out of his depth, and probably wishing he'd never heard of Naomi Fielding. However, Ava continued reading. "This bequest comes with one important condition. Should Naomi choose to abandon her family, through divorce, separation, or any other means, before Ava's 18th birthday, she shall receive nothing from my estate. Not $1, not one piece of furniture, not even the china set that belonged to her grandmother." The grandfather clock chimed 4 o'clock, and the sound seemed to echo through the suddenly charged atmosphere. Naomi looked up from her hands, her eyes red and desperate, and I could see the exact moment when the full implications hit her. She'd just lost everything. The house, the money, the security she'd probably been counting on to start her new life with Louis. All of it, gone, because she'd been too impatient to wait 8 more months for Ava to turn 18. But there was still more to come. I could see it in Ava's face, in the way she was holding that letter like it contained nuclear secrets. And somehow, I had the feeling that the real revelations were just getting started. Watching Naomi's world crumble in real time should have felt like victory, but all I felt was a hollow kind of satisfaction mixed with something that might have been pity. This was the woman I'd loved for 18 years, the mother of my child, and she was falling apart in front of strangers she'd brought into our home. But as I stood there in my own living room, listening to the grandfather clock tick away the seconds of her destroyed plans, I realized something important. This hadn't been luck or coincidence. This had been strategy. You want to know the really beautiful part about all this? I said, finally breaking the stunned silence that had settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Everyone turned to look at me. Naomi with desperate hope, Louis with growing alarm, Ava with curious anticipation, and even little Tyler paused in his magazine, browsing to glance up. I walked over to the window where Naomi sat slumped in defeat and looked down at her. Up close, I could see the fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when we got married. The way her carefully styled hair was starting to fall out of place, the expensive manicure that was already showing chips at the edges. She looked older than her 43 years, worn down by whatever guilt and stress had been eating at her during the months she'd been planning this betrayal. The beautiful part, I continued, is that I saw this coming from a mile away. Naomi's head snapped up, her eyes wide with something between shock and fear. What are you talking about? Come on, Naomi. Give me some credit. 23 years in logistics teaches you to pay attention to patterns, to notice when things don't add up. I started pacing, feeling more energized than I had in months. The late-night text you thought I didn't see. The sudden interest in going to the gym. The way you started picking fights over stupid shit, like you were trying to justify something to yourself. Louis shifted uncomfortably, probably starting to realize that his role in this drama wasn't as secret as he'd thought. Tyler had abandoned the magazines and was now exploring the entertainment center, pressing random buttons on the stereo system and creating little bursts of static. But the real tell, I said, turning back to Naomi, was how you started treating Aunt Eloise. The woman who saved your life, who gave you everything you needed to become the person you are, and suddenly you couldn't be bothered to visit her while she was dying. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. The memory of those conversations with Eloise came flooding back. She'd called me one evening about 8 months ago, her voice thin and tired from the chemo treatments. She'd been worried about Naomi, she said. Worried about the distance, the coldness, the way her beloved niece seemed to be pulling away just when family should have mattered most. So I went to see her. I continued, watching Naomi's face go from pale to gray. Not behind your back. I told you I was going to visit her that weekend, remember? You said you were too busy with some work project to come along. Marcus, please, Naomi started, but I held up a hand to stop her. Eloise was sharp right up until the end. You know that. Cancer might have been eating at her body, but her mind was crystal clear. She'd already figured out what you were up to. The secretiveness, the sudden disinterest in family gatherings, the way you'd started talking about finding yourself and exploring new possibilities. She knew you were planning to bail. I could see Louis trying to process this information, probably wondering how much Naomi had told him about her family situation, how many lies he'd been fed along with everything else. The poor bastard was in way over his head, and he was just starting to realize it. But here's what really impressed me about your aunt, I said, settling into my recliner like I was getting comfortable for a long story. She didn't just sit there and let it happen. She asked me point blank if I thought you were having an affair. Naomi made a small choking sound, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. And you know what I told her? I said yes, because by then, I was pretty damn sure you were. The signs were all there. I just hadn't wanted to see them. But Eloise, she wasn't blinded by 18 years of marriage and wishful thinking. She saw the situation for what it was. Ava was watching this unfold with fascination, still holding that letter like it was her ace in the hole. She'd grown up hearing stories about Aunt Eloise's legendary shrewdness, her ability to read people and situations with uncanny accuracy. Apparently, Those skills had remained intact right up until the end. So we made a plan, I said simply. Eloise had already been thinking about updating her will anyway. She wanted to make sure Ava would be taken care of if something happened to both of us. But when I confirmed her suspicions about your behavior, she decided to add a little insurance policy. The abandonment clause, Ava said quietly, and I nodded. Exactly. If you could wait until Ava turned 18, prove that you could put our daughter's stability ahead of your own selfish desires for just 8 more months, then you'd inherit everything as planned. But if you couldn't, I shrugged. Well, then you'd made your choice, hadn't you? Louis finally found his voice. You never told me any of this, he said to Naomi, his tone accusatory. You said your aunt was loaded and that you'd be getting the house and money when she died. You never mentioned anything about conditions or abandonment clauses. I didn't know, Naomi whispered, but her protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. Of course you didn't know, I said. Because if you had known, you might have been smart enough to wait. You might have put Ava's well-being ahead of your own immediate gratification. And frankly, both Eloise and I were betting that you wouldn't be able to do that. The clock chimed 4:30, and Tyler looked up from the stereo with interest, like he was just noticing that time was passing. In his world, this was probably just another boring grown-up conversation. He had no idea that he was witnessing the systematic destruction of the life his mother and Louis had planned together. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. The leather portfolio had been sitting in my truck for 3 weeks, waiting for this moment. I'd carried it with me on every business trip, every late-night drive home, like a talisman against the inevitable confrontation I knew was coming. While Naomi had been planning her grand betrayal, I'd been quietly building my own case, piece by methodical piece. 23 years in logistics had taught me that preparation was everything. You don't wait for problems to find you. You anticipate them and have solutions ready. I walked out to the truck with deliberate calm, aware that every eye in the room was following my movements. Through the living room window, I could see Naomi twisted around in her chair, watching me with the kind of desperate attention people reserve for potentially catastrophic news. Louis had moved closer to Tyler, probably some protective instinct kicking in as he sensed the situation spiraling further out of control. Only Ava seemed relaxed, still holding Aunt Eloise's letter like she was enjoying the show. The portfolio felt substantial in my hands as I walked back inside. Not just the physical weight of documents and photographs, but the weight of months of careful investigation, of sleepless nights spent connecting dots and building a case that would hold up in any courtroom in the country. I'd learned a long time ago that in business, emotions didn't matter. Facts mattered. Evidence mattered. And I had plenty of both. What's that? Louis asked as I set the portfolio on the coffee table with deliberate ceremony. His voice had gone up about half an octave, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air coming through the windows. This, I said, unzipping the leather case, is what we call due diligence. The first document I pulled out was a thick manila folder labeled photographic evidence in my neat block lettering. I'd always been methodical about record keeping, receipts, contracts, correspondence, but this investigation had required a different kind of documentation, the kind that would make a divorce attorney salivate and a cheating spouse's knees go weak. Let's start with the basics, I said, opening the folder to reveal a series of 8x10 color photographs. The quality was excellent. I'd invested in a good camera with a telephoto lens, nothing too fancy, but professional enough to capture clear, undeniable images. Here we have Naomi and Louis at the Riverside Inn on March 15th. That was a Tuesday, if memory serves. I was supposedly in Pittsburgh closing a contract with a steel supplier. I held up the photograph so everyone could see it clearly. Naomi and Louis were walking hand in hand across the hotel parking lot, both looking relaxed and happy in that way people do when they think they're getting away with something. Naomi was wearing that blue dress she claimed was for work meetings, and Louis had his arm around her waist with casual familiarity. March 22nd, I continued, pulling out another photo. Same hotel, different angle. And here's April 3rd, April 10th, April 24th. I laid the photographs out on the coffee table like playing cards, creating a timeline of their affair that was as undeniable as it was damaging. Naomi had gone completely white, her hands pressed against her mouth like she was trying to hold back words, or maybe just hold back from being sick. Lewis was staring at the photos with the horrified fascination of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. How did you? Lewis started, but I cut him off. How did I know where to find you? That's the beautiful thing about modern technology. I pulled out another folder, this one labeled electronic surveillance. Text messages, email records, credit card statements, GPS tracking from your phone. Amazing what you can find when you know where to look and you have the right resources. That wasn't entirely true. I'd hired a private investigator named Rodriguez who specialized in matrimonial cases. Former cop, knew all the tricks, and worth every penny of the $5,000 I'd paid him over the past 4 months. But letting them think I'd managed all this surveillance myself seemed more intimidating. But wait, there's more, I said, channeling my inner infomercial host as I reached for the third folder. This one was labeled Employment Records, and it was my personal favorite. Luis Martinez, age 24, currently employed by Hartwell Logistics Solutions as a junior account coordinator. The color drained from Lewis's face so fast I thought he might faint. That's impossible, he whispered. Is it? I pulled out a copy of his employment contract, complete with his signature at the bottom. Funny thing about shell companies, they're surprisingly easy to set up when you know the right lawyers. And when you've been in the logistics business as long as I have, you tend to acquire a lot of useful contacts. The truth was even simpler than that. I'd bought a controlling interest in Lewis's company 6 months ago through a series of intermediary purchases that kept my name off the paperwork. It had cost me nearly everything I'd saved for retirement, but watching Lewis's face right now made every penny worth it. You own his company? Ava asked, and there was genuine admiration in her voice. I own a lot of things, I said mildly, including Lewis's employment contract, which has some very interesting clauses about fraternization and moral turpitude. But the best was yet to come. I reached for the final folder, the one I'd been saving for last because I knew it would be the nuclear option, the thing that would completely destroy whatever fantasies they'd built around their new life together. And then there's this, I said, pulling out a sealed envelope with genetic testing services printed across the top. The DNA test results felt heavier than they should have in my hands. Just a few sheets of paper that would obliterate whatever remained of Naomi's carefully constructed fantasy. I'd been dreading this moment almost as much as I'd been anticipating it, because while the truth would set me free, it was going to destroy a 4-year-old kid who had no idea he was about to become collateral damage in his mother's war of selfishness. Tyler, I called gently, getting the boy's attention away from the stereo system. Can you come here for a second, buddy? The kid looked up at me with those big, curious eyes that all children have before the world teaches them to be suspicious. He was a cute kid. I had to give him that. Dark hair like Naomi's, but with features that belonged to neither her nor Lewis. He trotted over with the trusting enthusiasm of someone who still believed adults had everything figured out. Tyler, I said, crouching down to his eye level. Can you tell me about your daddy? Lewis is my new daddy, Tyler said with the matter-of-fact certainty that only kids can muster. Mommy says he's going to teach me to play baseball and take me fishing. I glanced up at Lewis, who had gone so pale he looked like he might pass out. Naomi was gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and I could see her chest rising and falling in short, panicked breaths. That's nice, I said to Tyler. But what about your first daddy? Your real daddy? Tyler's face scrunched up in concentration. Mommy says he went away. She says sometimes daddies go away and don't come back. The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. This kid had been told his father abandoned him, left him behind like yesterday's garbage, when the truth was sitting right there in the envelope in my hands. I looked up at Naomi and saw something in her expression that might have been shame, if she was still capable of feeling it. Well, here's the thing, Tyler, I said, standing up and opening the envelope. Sometimes mommies don't tell the whole truth about daddies. Marcus, don't, Naomi whispered, but her voice had no power left in it. She sounded like someone begging for mercy while knowing they didn't deserve it. I pulled out the first page of the DNA analysis, the summary page that spelled everything out in simple, undeniable terms. According to Gene Tech Laboratories, Tyler Andrew Morrison is not the biological child of Luis Martinez. Lewis made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. What? But that's not the interesting part. I continued, flipping to the second page. The interesting part is that Tyler Andrew Morrison is also not the biological child of Marcus Fielding. Ava's eyes went wide. Even she hadn't seen this coming, and she'd been holding on to Aunt Eloise's bombshell for weeks. Dad, what are you saying? I'm saying your mother has been very busy during those business trips to Atlanta. I held up the report so everyone could see the official letterhead, the case numbers, the scientific certainty of genetic testing. According to this analysis, Tyler's biological father is someone named David Chun, a guy Naomi was apparently seeing on the side, while she was seeing Lewis on the side while being married to me. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear Tyler's stomach growling. The poor kid was probably getting hungry, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire world was being dismantled around him. He looked between the adults with growing confusion, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. That's impossible, Lewis said, but his voice cracked on the word impossible. Naomi told me. Naomi told you a lot of things, I interrupted. She told you she was unhappily married. She told you Tyler was her son from a previous relationship. She told you she'd inherit money and property when her aunt died. She told you I was some workaholic who didn't deserve her. How much of any of that turned out to be true? Lewis looked at Naomi like he was seeing her for the first time, and maybe he was. The woman who'd seduced him with promises of a ready-made family and financial security had just been revealed as someone who couldn't keep track of her own lies, let alone deliver on her promises. This is insane, Naomi said, finally finding her voice. Her face was flushed now, anger replacing the shock and fear. This is my house. I've lived here for 15 years. You can't just… Actually, I can, I said, reaching into the portfolio one more time. Because this was never your house. The deed to 1247 Maple Street was printed on heavy paper stock, the kind that government offices use for official documents. I unfolded it carefully, like I was handling a historical artifact, which in a way I was. It was the document that proved who really owned the roof over our heads. Property records show that this house was purchased in 2009 by Eleanor Catherine Morrison, I read from the deed. Upon her death, ownership transferred to the beneficiaries named in her will, specifically Ava Fielding and Marcus Fielding. I looked up at Naomi, who was staring at the deed like it was written in a foreign language. Your name, I said gently, has never been on this deed. Not when we moved in, not when we refinanced, not ever. You've been living in Aunt Eloise's house for 15 years, and now you're living in mine and Ava's house. But I signed papers, Naomi protested weakly. Mortgage papers, insurance forms. You signed papers as a resident and co-borrower. I corrected. Never as an owner. Eloise insisted on maintaining ownership for tax purposes, remember? She said it would be better for everyone involved. The beautiful irony of it was that Naomi had agreed to the arrangement enthusiastically at the time. She'd loved the idea of living in a house they couldn't really afford, maintaining a lifestyle that was subsidized by her aunt's generosity. She'd never bothered to read the fine print, never questioned why the mortgage payments were so low, never wondered what would happen if her relationship with Eloise went south. You brought strangers into my home, I said, looking at Lewis and Tyler with something that might have been pity. Now I need you to leave it. Lewis didn't say another word. He just grabbed his keys from the coffee table, scooped up Tyler like the kid was a football, and headed straight for the front door. The poor bastard had probably woken up that morning thinking he was moving in with his girlfriend and her son, maybe planning to play house and live off her inheritance. Instead, he discovered he was unemployed, homeless, and caring for a child that wasn't even his biological responsibility. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Lewis, wait. Naomi called out, scrambling to her feet and chasing after him. We can figure this out. I can explain everything. But Lewis was already strapping Tyler into the car seat in his beat-up Civic, his movements quick and efficient like someone who'd done this routine 1,000 times before. The kid was crying now, not the dramatic wailing of a tantrum, but the confused, scared crying of someone who sensed that all the adults in his life had lost their minds simultaneously. There's nothing to figure out, Lewis said without looking at Naomi. His voice was flat, emotionless, like he'd already mentally checked out of this nightmare. You lied to me about everything. The kid, the money, the house, everything. I'm done. But Tyler needs stability. Naomi pleaded, standing in the driveway in her expensive shoes and designer clothes, looking like she was auditioning for the role of abandoned housewife. He needs a father figure. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you slept with half of Atlanta. Lewis shot back, firing up the engine. Find David Chun. He's the one who should be dealing with this mess. The Honda pulled out of our driveway with a screech of tires, leaving Naomi standing there alone on the asphalt like some kind of suburban tragedy. Through the rear window, I could see Tyler's little face pressed against the glass, still crying, still confused about why his world had just exploded without warning. I watched from the living room window as Naomi stood there for a long moment, probably trying to process the fact that her carefully orchestrated new life had just driven away in a 15-year-old car. When she finally turned around and walked back toward the house, her shoulders were slumped in defeat and her perfect makeup was starting to run. That went well, Ava said dryly from her position on the stairs. She'd been watching the whole drama unfold with the detached interest of someone observing a really good soap opera. Think he'll come back? Not a chance in hell, I replied, settling back into my recliner. Lewis may be young and stupid, but he's not suicidal. He just dodged a bullet the size of a freight train. Naomi came back inside looking like a completely different person than the confident, cold woman who tried to serve me divorce papers an hour ago. Her hair was disheveled, her face was blotchy, and there was something broken in her posture that made her look smaller, frilier, like someone had let all the air out of her. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we please talk about this like adults? I know I made mistakes, but we can work something out. I just need a few days to figure things out." A few days. Like this was some minor inconvenience instead of the complete destruction of our marriage and family. Like I was supposed to provide her with transitional housing while she figured out her next con game. "Naomi," I said, keeping my voice calm and reasonable, "you brought your lover and his kid into my house and tried to kick me out of my own life. You lied about paternity, you've been stealing from our joint accounts to fund your affairs, and you just lost the only inheritance that might have made any of this worthwhile. What exactly is there to work out?" She sank onto the couch, my couch, in my living room, in my house, and buried her face in her hands. For a moment, she looked genuinely remorseful, like the woman I'd married 20 years ago who used to cry during sad movies and leave little love notes in my lunch bag. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said through her fingers. "It just happened. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, I was in too deep to turn back." "It just happened," I repeated. "Like an affair is something that happens to you, like getting caught in the rain or coming down with the flu. Naomi, you made choices. Lots of them. You chose to cheat, you chose to lie, you chose to bring strangers into our daughter's home, and you chose to try to destroy our family for some fantasy about starting over with a 24-year-old. Ava had come down the stairs and was leaning against the doorframe, watching her mother with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Mom, you could have just asked for a divorce like a normal person. You didn't have to make it into some kind of elaborate scheme. I was trying to protect everyone," Naomi said weakly. "I thought if I could make a clean break, get established with Lewis, maybe we could all move on without anyone getting hurt." "Protect everyone," I said. "By lying to your lover about whose kid he was raising. By lying to your husband about where you were going and what you were doing. By lying to your daughter about the state of her family. Yeah, that's some real protective behavior right there." The fight had gone out of her completely. She sat there on my couch like a deflated balloon, all the arrogance and smugness drained away, leaving behind just a middle-aged woman who'd gambled everything on a fantasy and lost it all. "I filed the divorce papers 3 weeks ago," I said quietly. "Full custody of Ava, no alimony, no asset division. Based on abandonment, adultery, and fraud. My lawyer says it's pretty much a slam dunk." Naomi's head snapped up. "You can't do that. I have rights." "You have the right to contest it in court," I interrupted. "And I have about $40,000 worth of evidence that says you'll lose. Badly. Your choice." The silence stretched out between us like a chasm, filled with 18 years of shared history that had just been reduced to legal documents and property disputes. Outside, I could hear the neighborhood kids getting home from school, their voices carrying on the afternoon air as they played in yards and rode bikes down sidewalks, living normal lives that didn't involve DNA tests and divorce papers and the systematic destruction of everything they thought they knew about their families. What happens now? Naomi asked finally. Now you pack your things and leave, I said. And you pray that the court system is more forgiving than I am. 3 months after Naomi packed her bags and moved into a crappy studio apartment across town, life started feeling normal again. Not the old normal. That version had been built on lies and performance and carefully maintained pretenses, but a new kind of normal that felt solid, authentic, like a house built on rock instead of sand. Ava and I settled into routines that actually made sense, cooking dinner together most nights, watching movies without having to worry about someone's mood swings or mysterious phone calls. The divorce proceedings had been as brutal as I'd predicted. Naomi's lawyer tried to play the victim card, painting her as a woman driven to desperate measures by an emotionally absent husband. But when Rodriguez testified about the surveillance evidence, when the DNA results were entered into the record, when the courts saw the financial records showing her systematic deception, the judge wasn't buying what they were selling. The final decree gave me full custody of Ava, awarded me the house and all assets, and left Naomi with nothing but her personal belongings and a mountain of legal debt. The community reaction had been swift and merciless. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, Naomi's spectacular fall from grace became the kind of cautionary tale that people would be talking about for years. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Her book club kicked her out. Even her hairdresser started claiming she was too booked to fit Naomi into her schedule. But it was Ava who really impressed me during those months. Instead of falling apart or rebelling or any of the things you'd expect from a teenager whose family had imploded, she threw herself into her schoolwork with laser focus. She finished her senior year with a 4.2 GPA, got accepted to Columbia with a partial scholarship, and started making plans for her future like someone who'd learned that the only person you could really count on was yourself. Dad, she said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner, I want to write about what happened. I looked up from loading the dishwasher. Write about it how? Like a blog post. Maybe an article for the school newspaper. Something about what it's like when your mom tries to replace your entire family. She was scrubbing a pot with more energy than it required, working through her thoughts with her hands. I keep thinking about other kids who might be going through something similar, you know? Like maybe hearing about someone else's experience would help them feel less alone. The idea made me nervous, putting our family's dirty laundry out there for everyone to see, turning our pain into content. But looking at Ava's face, seeing the determination there, I realized this wasn't about revenge or attention-seeking. This was about processing trauma, about taking something ugly and turning it into something that might help other people. You sure you're ready for that kind of exposure? I asked. Once it's out there, you can't take it back. I'm sure, she said firmly. And besides, it's not like people don't already know what happened. At least this way, I get to tell the real story instead of letting people make up their own versions. She published the blog post 2 weeks later, titling it, How My Mom Tried to Replace Me. The writing was raw, honest, and surprisingly mature. She talked about the confusion of discovering her mother's betrayal, the anger at being treated like collateral damage, and the strange relief of finally understanding why their family had felt so unstable for so long. The post went viral within days. Shares, comments, media requests. Suddenly Ava was fielding calls from talk show producers and magazine editors who wanted to hear more of her story. A literary agent reached out about turning the experience into a book. Most importantly, she started getting messages from other teenagers who'd gone through similar family upheavals, kids who felt like they were drowning in adult drama and needed to know they weren't alone. I got offered an internship, she told me one afternoon, waving her phone excitedly. At Hearst Media, they want me to write more pieces about family dynamics and teen perspectives on divorce. As for me, I'd started writing again. Something I hadn't done since college, when I'd had dreams of being the next great American novelist before reality and bills and responsibilities took over. Now, with the house quiet in the evenings and my future suddenly wide open, I found myself staying up late with black coffee and a laptop, working on what might eventually become a book about second chances and starting over at middle age. The letters started coming about 6 months after the divorce was finalized. First through the mail, handwritten notes on cheap stationery that reeked of desperation and drugstore perfume. Then emails to my work account, somehow bypassing the filters I'd set up. Finally, messages delivered through old mutual friends who thought maybe enough time had passed. Maybe I'd be willing to listen to Naomi's side of the story. She wants to explain. Linda Morrison told me over coffee, Linda being Naomi's cousin and apparently the designated messenger. She says there were things you didn't understand, circumstances that made her feel trapped. I set down my coffee cup and looked at Linda with the kind of patience you reserve for people who mean well, but just don't get it. Linda, she brought her boyfriend and his kid into my house and tried to kick me out. What exactly is there to understand? The explanations kept coming anyway. Through text messages that somehow made it past my blocked numbers. Through voicemails left on Ava's phone when Naomi couldn't reach mine. Always the same theme. She'd made mistakes, she'd been confused, she deserved a chance to make things right. We never replied. It became a running joke between Ava and me, actually. Every time another pathetic attempt at communication arrived, we'd toss it in what we called the Naomi file, a shoebox in the kitchen where we collected all her desperate attempts at relevance. The box filled up pretty quickly. Some people don't deserve second chances, Ava said one night as we sat on our apartment balcony in Manhattan, looking out at the city lights. She was home from Colombia for winter break, more confident and self-assured than ever, her internship having turned into a full-time offer after graduation. They need to learn from losing the first one. The wisdom in that statement hit me hard. My daughter, barely 19 years old, had figured out something that had taken me decades to understand. Not everyone deserves forgiveness. Not every relationship can be salvaged. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is walk away and never look back. I finished the first chapter of my novel that night, sitting at my desk with the city sprawling out below me like a carpet of possibilities. The story was about a man who thought he'd lost everything, only to discover he'd actually gained his life back. Fiction, of course, but based on some pretty solid truth. As I typed the final sentence and saved the file, I realized something profound. I hadn't lost a wife in that suburban living room 18 months ago. I'd gained my freedom.